here in our new $70-something million building, and I'm really proud to show that off to you as well. But here tonight, not to look around, but to perhaps imbibe in the spirit of a great Australian. You'll hear me say a little later on that I was formed to a large degree in my thoughts and in my approaches to the way this wonderful democracy works by a year that I'll never forget, 1972, when I had the great honour to be ADC to His Excellency the Right Honourable Sir Paul Hasluck, Governor-General of Australia. It was a wonderful year. I was thrilled, therefore, to be asked to deliver this oration, not least because it's named for this great man. When Sir Paul was Governor-General, I was his Army aide-de-camp. I learnt so much just in that 1 year that I hope some of that will flow through what I say to you tonight. One of the dilemmas for the orator on such an occasion is to make your effort worthy, to honour the name of the oration's muse. So what theme should one choose? This is also compounded for me by the eminence of my predecessor orator, a man I admire mightily, the Honourable John Howard, OMAC. But soldiers always ought to be selected in part for their courage. So here goes. I entered the notion of the oration thinking I would stick closely to the usual knitting for a retired general. Hence the bullets or beans tag. But when I thought about that, especially in the last couple of weeks when I was putting my thoughts together, it seemed to me that simply sticking to that title would be a canvas at once too large and too small. While there are profound security dimensions for our lives and those of our kids going forward, life is wider than simply our security preoccupations. I just came back from Africa, where the paradox of some of the most advanced and developed communities one might ever wish to see, especially in the southern part of the continent, is offset by some of the most desperately needy, strife-torn communities in an intractable situation where, despite best endeavours, their development has been at snail's pace or in some cases has gone backwards. The period with Sir Paul, when I was reflecting on the nature of this oration, gave me inspiration for my evolved theme. Let me say how it came about. It was in 1972 when I accompanied the Governor-General to Papua New Guinea. That was then still an Australian protectorate, but moving inexorably to be fully independent. Sir Paul was to preside at the ceremonial opening of Parliament in Port Moresby, in the relatively new House of Assembly at Waigani in the capital. As you know, he'd been Minister for Territories at one time of his political career, and he was, of course, a most distinguished Minister for External Affairs. I became keenly aware on that trip. You sit with the principal for hours. You're constantly near him when he's having conversations with other eminent Australians and the political leadership of the emerging nation. I became aware of an encyclopedic knowledge and his keen, ongoing interest in what were the conditions and aspirations not only of the citizens of Papua New Guinea, but of the other South Pacific states. That was, for me, the first of what's now been numerous visits into the region. I commanded the post-tsunami recovery in 1998 up there. I went to Bougainville on a number of occasions to visit the troops on the peacekeeping mission there. I was involved quite strongly with the Australian-led operation into Solomon Islands in 2003. I've been back on the Kokoda track a couple of times since. The most significant of my visits into the region, though, would have to be to Fiji in 2007, in the aftermath of the military coup led by Commodore Frank Bainimarama, who to this day remains the unelected Prime Minister of the Republic. I was a member of an eminent persons group representing the Pacific Forum's foreign ministers. Together with representatives from Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu and Samoa, we, the EPG, had several days of meetings and consultations with prominent community members and leadership figures from the regime, including a meeting with the President, and near the end, a meeting with the Prime Minister and key members of his cabinet. Perhaps at this point, a couple of observations are in order. First, the ghost of Sapor would have been somewhat surprised that his old ADC could be deemed eminent. I concur with that too. Secondly, I did have some form in relation to matters Fiji. I was a senior staff officer to the Australian Chief of Army back in 1987 when the first coup occurred. And in those days of innocence and perhaps a little bit of ignorance of exactly what was going on in that wonderful group of islands, we had soldiers floating around on Navy ships off the coast. But in the end, the government was clearly of the view that if it could be avoided that there be an intervention from an outside power, then it should be done. It's correct to say, though, that from that point on we monitored events in Fiji very closely. Australia, though, by and large maintained a continued close relationship with the government of the day in Fiji, and not least within the organs of government, military to military. So I knew many of the players. I knew Commodore Bainimarama and had spent some time before the coup, when I was in service, giving him unwelcome advice when he was on a visit to Australia. I'm quite sure that Sapor, in contemplating Fiji's last 26 years, would be horrified. In particular, the readiness of the military to seek to either overthrow governments or to bend them to their will. In his view, that would be most lamentable and a terrible example for other states in the region. 4 times now, governments have been thrown out or coerced without the benefit of the ballot box. Newspapers have been shut down, dissent suppressed, courts manipulated, diplomats thrown out, all in the name of protecting the welfare of the Fijian people, who strangely enough haven't been given the opportunity to pass comment through an election. At the end of that visit to Fiji back in 2007, the EPG conveyed our concern to Commodore Bainimarama, and we voiced that concern in our report back to the Pacific Forum. Perhaps understandably, the welcome mat for a return visit by the EPG is no longer evident. Australia and New Zealand sensibly took a strong but constrained approach to the sanctions applied in the wake of the latest coup, but the efflux of time and the diligent efforts of the regime to gain workarounds, alternatives, and the watering down of the sanctions has meant that there's been no return at the present time to representative government. Don't get me wrong, a more intrusive set of responses by Australia and New Zealand and others in the region who deplored the state of affairs in Fiji would most likely have been disastrous. But as Sir Paul might have observed, clannish and anti-democratic behaviour in our regional neighbours is still a serious impediment to development. Think on this. Hardly any members of the Republic of Fiji military forces will recall a time when the Fijian military considered it unthinkable to topple a lawfully elected government. For those who believe the influence of these sorts of political situations stops at the low water mark of our island neighbours, consider the alarming actions which recently accompanied the round of serious political uproar in PNG. I mean the potential and occasionally actual roles being played by the Defence Force in that country and the constabulary, aligning with political factions and using armed forces to prevent access. For most Australians, our abiding perspective of Papua New Guinea is through an emotional prism. The decades of protectorate status, KIAPs or district officers leading bearers and police and later PNG soldiers into the wild highlands. Images of fuzzy-wuzzy angels assisting wounded diggers on the Kokoda track. These are true and wonderful images, but the real and present truth is always much more complex. Sir Paul would point to the right of the nation to self-determine and self-manage its own future. But at the same time, he would point to PNG's strategic imperative to Australia and its strategic dependence on us. The people of PNG are our closest neighbours, and neither of us can or wants to move house. Hardly a nation on earth has been propelled more quickly from such a basic level of social infrastructure all the way to the aspirations and appetites of a modern nation. What does Australia want from PNG and Fiji and the other smaller Pacific Island countries? It may sound arrogant to be canvassing our wants of these countries given the disparity in wealth and development which is in our favour. Maybe, but it is not an unreasonable question. Nobody seems to shrink from articulating what the Pacific Island countries want from us. We want, for all of them, safety and security and rapid and sustainable development. We fervently desire for them all internal and external harmony and equitable relationships. Now, there's perhaps an overabundance of keywords and phrases in that list of wants. More interesting is what explicitly is missing from that list and empirically absent from our policies towards those nations collectively and individually. We have no preference for their form or practice of government. Republics, kingdoms, commonwealths, dependencies, it should be all the same to us. We do know, however, as one of the world's most successful and stable democracies, that pluralistic and renewable government is ultimately safer for the long-term cohesion and harmony, and thus the development of its adherents. We know that the bedrock of our own successful model of government is the professionalism and integrity of our public service and the judiciary and the media and the independence of those last two institutions. This matrix of our wants for them sits above the contemporary ebb and flow of life in the Pacific Island countries. But it's only fair that I ask the next question. If I had to hazard a list of the expectations that the Pacific Island countries have of us, it would go like this. First, that we share with them the good fortune of our wealth, and not just in money terms, although first and foremost, it is our money that is of most use. There are social, cultural, technological aspects of our wealth which they will prize while ever there is a disparity. Secondly, they fervently desire our respect beyond simple forbearance. By this I mean not just the patronising toleration of their ways, but an implicit upholding of the richness and power and centrality of their cultural mores. If we can fulfil these first two, then we are welcome to engage with them on their journey of development. This, of course, is the most difficult thing for us, to find the middle ground between a foreign aid policy which says, do what we want, our way, or get no money. And the other side, here's the money, good luck, no strings attached. Just as vapid in the eyes of the Pacific Island countries are the well-meaning hordes of Australians who seek to immerse into and imbibe of their beautiful traditional cultures, but who contribute virtually nothing to community development. What can we do now which is significant and important and enduring, with outcomes still beneficial in many years ahead? Now, a whole separate argument, debate, discussion, consideration could be had about any climate change mitigation initiatives. Tuvalu disappearing under the water, then that sort of iconic image which we would be horrified about. Set aside the conventional aid programs which require patience and longevity to bear fruit. Then we have to look more holistically at the region and our relationship with it. In an economic sense, at the present, we are the major supermarket, and also in some areas, the wholesale distribution warehouse for the region. The people of the Pacific Islands, to a large degree, must shop with us, either by visiting the regional supermarket or by accepting material from us as a distribution warehouse through travelling salesmen. Theirs is very much a supplicant or take it or leave it relationship. I think we should contemplate some kind of closer and interdependent economic relationship with the countries of the Pacific Forum. Perhaps it need not be as comprehensive or as close as the European Union, but I would start with the objects in and the operations of the EU in mind. I can't imagine a greater real contribution to the strong and peaceful development and viability of the region than an initiative of this nature. It would not only flow into commercial arrangements, but into labour markets and thus into social and cultural areas. I know that this suggestion is a major step forward from the recently mooted notion of guest workers, but as I looked into the future, I couldn't see the opportunities for the domestic economies of the Pacific Islands to withstand challenges and to flourish. I think for them, in an economic sense, to simply stagnate is to invite a plethora of vexing social and cultural issues which might come home to roost with future Australian generations. If we do embark on something positive, significant and transformational with our friends in our closer neighbourhood, then we really will have contributed greatly to peace and security in the region. Sir Paul would have had a view on this, and whether he embraced or disagreed my approach, he would want me to finish this oration in his name this evening with the strongest reminder that our interest in, and thus obligation towards, our close neighbours in the Pacific is inescapable and perpetual. Thank you very much. There's now time for questions, and I understand that things like the Korean Peninsula and what have you, that wasn't quite on the horizon when I was writing these words, might be of interest to some of you. So I'd be happy to take questions about what I said there, or anything you think Sir Paul would allow in a situation such as this. He's not here, so you can take liberties. Yes, the lady there.
Do you think it would have made any difference to the development of PNG if Australia had an involvement, a closer involvement for a longer period?
Yeah, look, this is the great dilemma of the decolonising post-World War II world. Who remembers the extraordinary repatriation of colonial powers? Take an example, the Portuguese quitting all their colonial possessions in almost in a heartbeat in 1974. Change of government, off they went. And of course we can see in our own region that created a vacuum, which was a very unfortunate episode for Timor. We're actually thought we were being measured, but you can always say later on, well, we're a bit quick. But there's the aspirations of the people of the country that you've been looking after. And I'll use that benign term. They'd probably use a different term in Papua New Guinea at that time. I think it was Mr. Whitlam quickly accelerated the process in the when Labor came to power in '72, and 75 or 74 perhaps it became complete. Julian.
I take you back to Fiji, which you mentioned earlier. Given that the Fijians are currently writing a new constitution, that there may be democratic elections at some point in the future, what will happen if a party that's led by someone other than Commodore Bainimarama is elected, and to what extent will a new government be able to deal with the old military regime in some appropriate manner? That
would be a fascinating question, but I have to put down a very strong marker here. That's obviously a matter for the Fijian people. They will. All we want is for there to be a government in place which allows and provides the services you'd expect from a representative government. No summary arrests, that sort of thing. We know from bitter experience, not having had it in our own country but observing it in so many others, that you can't have a happy and developing population when those sorts of rules apply. So for them would be what happens next, and that's not a matter for Australia. I would not even venture an opinion as to whether there's indemnities, amnesties, rule a line, move on. I take as my text the loudly expressed attitude of the East Timorese government. A mouse that roared. Did you get that on? That is the ACU pet mouse. Its name is Timothy. And it's carrying a $100 note strapped to its body. Thank you. I take as my text the attitude of the East Timorese government, which said we have to move on in its relationship with Indonesia. They're not saying that things weren't done, that they had no complaints. They're saying, but we have to look to the future. I take as my text what happened in South Africa. But that is a matter for the people directly concerned, and Australia should stand ready to support whatever a democratically elected government presents as their way forward.
General, you mentioned the issue of sovereignty among sort of our regional partners. What do you think the greatest risk for Australia's sovereignty is in the next few decades?
Well, we're a country of great wealth and a maritime middle power. The maritime part there, in case we get thoughts of, armadas and, Sir Francis Drake, that sort of thing, that's our strength and our vulnerability. Everything we need, everything we supply passes over the sea. The sea is a barrier, the sea is also, in some ways, a vulnerability for us. So in that regard, I think instability in the Indo-Pacific region, is a threat. Doesn't matter what causes it or why it's happening. You can posit half a dozen scenarios where trade is depressed, countries are on edge, arms races might occur. All of that is bad for what I might call peaceful commerce, and that's the lifeblood of this nation. So we are not yet, and probably it's hard to see how we could be, so self-sufficient that that's a barrier out there and not an easy approach to our front door.
General Cosgrove, can you please explain why we don't have any strategic oil reserves in Australia?
Yeah. Well, I think the fact is that we have limited reserves, but we don't foresee a situation where the cost of maintaining very substantial reserves can be measured against an immediate threat. That could change overnight, and that's your point, that the Gulf is a very can be very tenuous link for oil traffic. I suppose, to be a cynic, at the moment, who would suffer more than us? Chinese, Indians, United States. At the moment, not for a long time. They're becoming self-sufficient. So I suppose looking at that, we say, well, we'll have very modest reserves. That leads to a whole other thing. If you haven't got lots of oil, what are you using as your energy source? So we don't want to go there. It's a family program.
The Malaysian elections next month, if there's turmoil in those elections or from those elections, how do you think Australia should handle it?
By wishing everybody well. I mean, they're a democracy of quite long standing. We can observe, we can read newspaper reports, but it's their country. I think we should hope, just for the safety of all involved, that the elections are trouble-free, and then work like Billy O to make accommodations with whoever comes into government. Same with Indonesia, same with every one of these other countries which is coming up to some form of governmental change. But the point about our commentary or perceptions of other democracies around the region, or countries which don't purport to be democracies, is, can we get on with them, and are they doing things which are so affronting to our values that we can't countenance it? And in that respect, there's not very many of those sort of countries in the globe, thank heavens.
Yeah, well, you referred to North Korea earlier. What's your feeling about the situation there, and is there a serious risk?
There's always a risk with a regime which is so closed and sort of so adept at manipulating dialogue, manipulating the message. I personally would think the media reports are getting it pretty spot on, that it could well be as much an internal flexing of muscles as it is related to the external position of the Republic of Korea and the United States. I firmly have the view that China would be extraordinarily diligent about containing any mad act of aggression or provocation out of North Korea, because everybody suffers if there is a confrontation of that nature, but China would not want it to spiral into a war.
General, you talked about Australia's importance in maintaining peace and stability and in the region. We've got troops deployed in various near neighbours and peacekeeping roles. How well equipped are we to deal with further instability should it arise in the Asia-Pacific region? Should the requirement be for Australia to go and have further engagement?
I think it's a threshold that we need to manage with greatest care. In 2003, when Sir Alan Kemakeza came to Australia and asked the government of the day for urgent assistance, I suspect that was a tremendously difficult policy decision for the government, because Australia had been a benign giver of aid and sometimes advice which was not really appreciated, but not an interventionist. And there we were invited in, but for the first time we saw armed Australian troops on the streets of a South Pacific neighbour. It hadn't been done before outside of World War II. And in that regard, I was relieved that the intervention in the Solomon Islands, which was led by multinational unarmed police, soldiers standing in the background. In all these years, no shots have been fired, no Solomon Islander has been hurt in a violent act by the multinational force. Might have been arrested or something, but they haven't been subjected to military violence. But still, there was a threshold, and I think if we are to live in harmony, we need to carefully manage that we don't engage a new threshold where we bluster in. So that's back to my remarks about Fiji. It was never on the cards that we would bully our way in there, although we could regret profoundly things we might have seen happening. It was not to the stage where we were going to enforce a solution from outside on any country. Remember that Alan Kemakeza had to basically implore the Australian government for that intervention because of all these traditional, historical and, if you like, cultural inhibitions.
General, I was interested in the last idea that you mentioned about something like the European Union maintaining the Asia-Pacific Union. However, my question would be that in that model, there are certain unifying factors like European heritage, and some of those countries are already or would be already on a level playing in terms of economic model. However, in this case, there would be massive disparity if you made. So wouldn't that be much more harder to even think of? I would not say that we should be slavishly adopting the EU model. I'm saying that it represents a series of parameters and conditions, and we would shop from those and have a bespoke and entirely appropriate model. Where it would be useful is in the transfer of wealth for work done. So it is the sort of supersize of the guest worker program, which I think is a bit episodic. But an example would be, should each nation, as a sovereign but small entity, operate its own airline? They want aeroplanes to fly in and out, but do they have to have all the expense of raising an airline and all that sort of thing? There are all kinds of things that are useful there. I mean, we could probably help with a regional military training establishment. Would train everybody's police and everybody's soldiers, sailors, etc. What we would not do is have that as an Australian entity. That would be a regionally managed entity.
It'll be difficult at the moment, given some of the experiences of some of the regional nations and their military, to sort of incorporate that, but maybe that's part of the solution. Paul?
I find that suggestion most tantalising. In your experience, what's the likelihood of it eventuating from within and from within the countries that you referred to?
Well, it has to be voluntary. There has to be something in it. I mean, people joined the European Union because they were, in the end, it was a domino thing that you didn't want to be the group that was trying to go it alone. But there were advantages in joining, all to do with markets. There's also a certain sense of interdependence, and therefore less need for member nations to rush off to other countries with their needs. We should be able to, with the combined budgets of Australia and New Zealand, be able to extend tremendous non-aid money simply in the terms of trade to these other countries, whereby if the income of each Pacific Island state went relatively through the roof, and you wouldn't just say, well, that's on top of the aid. You'd probably adjust the aid in some way, but in any event, what you're saying is there is this eternal relationship. But are you going to have an eternal relationship with a state that becomes rapidly unviable in a population and economical sense? I think probably that's more difficult.
General, in his introduction, Senator Fifield spoke about your leadership of troops in East Timor, inspiring both troops, but also our nation more largely. Australia, I think it's fair to say, held its breath, as our troops did. I was in Parliament then, as a new member of Parliament, and our nation did hold its breath. There wasn't a large loss of life among our troops or indeed among people in East Timor. What do you put that down to? What was your secret?
Oh, look, I don't think there was a secret that belonged to me. It was actually a secret that belonged to about 5,000 Aussies, a couple of, 1,000 or so more Kiwis, and the troops of 22 nations. But fundamentally, it was the first couple of weeks where the story unfolded. Unfashionable to say it, but I think I have to take my hat off to TNI, who, the Indonesian military, who, having understood the game was up, the jig's up, got to leave, did so. There were a few incidents which were regrettable, but that move was reasonably effective. It was certainly quick. Vividly remember Timorese lining up to throw rocks over a dockyard fence, and a TNI infantry battalion getting on landing ships. They weren't best pleased, so I had to interpose an infantry battalion between the East Timorese and the Indonesians. But we played our part there. Our part was to refrain from being judgmental or partial. We had to ensure that there were no weapons carried. Janana Guzmao will tell you that he had a serious falling out with me over some of our troops disarming some of his militia, but that was the impartiality of what we had to do. We made up, of course. So I put it down to the troops, and I put it down to, I did mention TNI, and they got on with the job they had to do. I put it down to the sense of deliverance of the East Timorese people, and the patience and the forbearance of the armed East Timorese, the militia, not the militia, the Falintal. And I put it down to the compassion of the Aussies. I said in the speech to Parliament when I got home that the Australians and the Kiwis and those others who were with us were tremendously compassionate. And the moment they found their feet and understood that they were projecting their nation to the other 21 nations and to the East Timorese, they were just, they make you so proud. They were just marvellous.
We don't hear much about Irian or the people there, and I know there's some refugee camps over the border with North and Papua New Guinea. Can you comment on that?
Well, we want the Indonesians to find a modality to satisfy the indigenous population of Irian Jaya, plus all the other people who've moved in over many decades now. The ethnicity, or if you like, the background makeup of the population of Irian Jaya is almost 50-50 between transmigrants and Irian Jayanese, the indigenous people to that part of the island. So we want them to, we encourage them to, and we stand ready. They don't ask, but we stand ready to broker anything they might want, and we have to reassure them that we don't have designs in some way on Irian Jaya.
You told us that you were able to come to support him for a year. Did Sir Paul do military service himself?
No, he served his nation as a diplomat during World War II. A most distinguished man, went off. Oh, he was also in other jobs, but I particularly go to his diplomatic efforts over in Washington and back here. Hugely important figure. I mean, the uniforms always get the glossy photos in the history books, but there were many millions of Australians making sure that our efforts were seen and our needs were met. He was one of them. And he's very self-effacing about that too. I think I've exhausted them.
Could I call to the lectern Associate Vice-Chancellor Dr John Ballard to move the vote of thanks for General Cosgrove. Dr Ballard.
Senators, Members of Parliament, the Honourable Nick Hasluck and Mrs Sally Ann Hasluck, General Cosgrove, Pauline Nugent, honoured guests, ladies and gentlemen, one and all. It's a privilege to propose a vote of thanks for this evening. Personally, and on behalf of the Hasluck Foundation, the Australian Catholic University, and all gathered here tonight, I wish to extend a very hearty vote of thanks to General Cosgrove for his presentation, sharing with us his views of what are emerging challenges for Australia. Please join me in expressing our appreciation.